so I'm going to be speaking today about some of the research my group has been doing in microplastics. The other part of my work, as Emily said, has more to do with diatom and pollen analysis in sediment cores and looking at changes in lake ecosystems. And as Emily mentioned, I'm based at Carleton University in Ottawa in Canada. And that's where I've been doing most of my work in microplastics. So that's somewhat important because it's the capital of Canada. It's a government city. We don't have a lot of industry. So most of the plastic material that we're finding is secondary microplastics. So it's not primary microplastics from industry applications. It's more secondary microplastics from the breakdown of larger material or from consumer products. And then I'm also doing a bit of work in the Canadian Arctic as well, looking at how microplastics are moving through Arctic systems. So there's increasing recognition that plastic's an important pollution source globally, and the Canadian government, along with governments globally, are moving to classify some plastic materials as toxic and starting to build monitoring programs to monitor and evaluate plastic concentrations in the environment. And part of the reason for this is that we're producing so much plastic material now. This is from a paper a few years ago now in Science Advances by Guerre and al. But they've quantified, just how much plastic we're producing and where is it ending up from 1950 to 2015. And the take-home message here is that really we've produced in that time period something like 8,300 million metric tons of plastic, and over half of that has been discarded. So these are mainly single-use plastics. Plastics are cheap material. They're often meant just to be used once and thrown away. And relatively little of that globally has been recycled. And in Canada, the situation is very similar to that last figure I just showed. And this is a figure from a study that was commissioned by Environment Canada to track where the plastic material is going over 1 year. So this is 2016. And it's a very similar take-home message to what the global, the figure for the global plastic cycle showed, in that a lot of plastic is discarded. About 86% of all that plastic ends up in landfills. A small percentage, so about 9% in Canada, is actually recycled, even though we think we're recycling a lot of it. The truth is a lot of it ends up in landfills. And then where my research comes in, and research of other people looking at plastics in the environment, is really this 1% at the bottom of the graph. So they're estimating about 1% of that plastic, which is still 29,000 metric tons of plastic a year, is escaping, so leaking into the environment. And this is important because we're producing more and more plastic every year. There's been about a 20-fold increase of plastic production between 1964 and in this figure 2014. But for this workshop, I think what's a really important point is that plastic production really started to take off in the 1950s. So we're not talking about the Paleo-Anthropocene here necessarily, definitely much more in the Anthropocene period, but we are finding it, in the environment shortly after 1950, depending on the population density of the region. So a lot of the work we're doing right now is to sort of characterize plastic concentrations in different environments so we can figure out where plastic is coming from and where it's ending up, really the sources and sinks of plastic, and then how much is ending up in the sediment, and is it evenly distributed in the sediment. And when we are taking sediment cores to sort of look at changes in plastic concentration through time. Where should we be coring in lakes, for example? So we've done a fair number of studies in the Ottawa River, which is close located to us, and we do this typically with surface trawls using a manta net. And we do these trawls for 20 minutes, and in that time we're sampling about 20,000 liters of water. And we find a lot of plastic in these samples, and we find plastics in every single samples we collect. So a lot of the plastics we find are these fragments here, which is essentially from the breakdown of larger material. We also find a few microbeads, which get a lot of press, but we find less of those. But about 90% or more of the plastic pieces we find are what we call microfibers. And these are these small fibers of microplastics that are coming off. A lot of it are coming off our clothing and synthetic fibers we're wearing and ending up in the environment. And this is important as well when we think about using plastics to trace local maybe occurrence of humans, is that these microfibers are also the main type of plastic that are distributed or transported atmospherically in the environment as well. So they can be transported really long distances, and they're fairly widely dispersed. And the microfibers are the same types of plastic we find in dust in the lab, for example, that we have to be really careful with contamination when we're doing these analysis to try and limit any dust at all from falling into the samples. The larger fragments and material like this aren't as easily transported in the atmosphere and aren't found in dust, for example. But no matter where we sample in the Ottawa River, we do see clear signatures of plastic both in the water and in the sediment. And we do get higher concentrations of microplastics occurring in more urban environments. So here near the city of Ottawa versus more rural or even woodland or forested environments in Northern Ontario. And in the sediments, we typically find in the Ottawa River and lakes connected to the Ottawa River, we're typically finding about 100 to 400 microplastic pieces per kilogram dry weight of material. So the plastics are there in every single sample, but they're at relatively low abundance to other paleo indicators that might be used in paleoecological studies, for example. So they're much more similar, I think, to looking at macrofossils in sediment than they are looking at pollen or diatoms in sediment. They're just at much lower abundances, at least in the samples where we're working. And the distribution of the microplastics in the sediments is pretty evenly distributed. So that's one thing we were interested in, is where should we core for these sediments? Are they going to be in higher concentrations near the shorelines of lakes, for example? But we see a lot of variability, but it's not related to particle size of the sediment or the organic content of the sediment. So it's probably more related to a nearby local source of plastics, like an urban area. And the results we're getting for the Ottawa area, which again is more, less industry in the Ottawa area, is similar to what's been reported in other Canadian-based studies. This one from Lake Ontario. Here they're getting around 100 to 400 samples or pieces of plastic per kilogram of sediment, and they can get up to an order of magnitude higher than that in really industrialized areas around Lake Ontario. So we haven't seen numbers that high in the Ottawa area, but certainly near more industrial areas, they are getting higher concentrations of plastic. The other thing that we're looking at in trying to understand how plastic is moving around the environment is how plastic is moving through our wastewater treatment systems. So we've done some studies here with the city of Gatineau's wastewater treatment plant, and just looking at how much plastic is coming in and where it ends up. So our findings show that a lot of plastic is coming in through our wastewater stream, and I guess this ties into the last talk a bit about, well, loosely about the sterols and stanols and human waste, but essentially a lot of plastic is now moving through our wastewater treatment system. And for example, in the city of Gatineau, we're finding about 30 pieces of microplastic per liter coming in through the influent of the wastewater treatment system. And then the effluent leaving the wastewater treatment plant is orders of magnitude lower. So a lot of that plastic is ending up in the biosolids. And in Canada, we put that biosolids on agricultural fields. So we're trying to understand how the plastic, all these microplastics in the biosolids are moving through our waterways, but it definitely represents a really large concentration of microplastic material and movement of microplastic material in the environment. So again, you might be getting high concentrations of microplastics in a region, in a more rural region, a farming region where a lot of these biosolids might be applied to the fields. So in our wastewater treatment plant study, and this is similar to other studies around the globe, we found a large reduction in microplastics in the liquid portion of the wastewater treatment plant. So about a 99.9% reduction is our best estimate. But that still, represents a lot of, because such a high concentration of microplastics is coming in through the influent, it still represents a conduit of plastics to the Ottawa River in this case, or water bodies, that we estimate at about 6.5 million fragments a day from this one wastewater treatment plant. And that's only about 0.1% of the plastic material coming in. The rest of it is in the biosolids that are being applied on fields. The other area I mentioned that we're working on microplastics in sediments and in water is the Canadian Arctic. And here we're looking at how the occurrence of plastics in remote Canadian Arctic islands that are uninhabited. So one example is this Herschel Island in the Yukon, so in the Western Canadian Arctic. It's an uninhabited Arctic island, so researchers go there to conduct research, and there's also hunting that takes place on Herschel Island, but no one lives there permanently. But we still find, microplastics in the sediment and water from Herschel Island. So in the Arctic, because the concentrations of plastic really start to increase in 1950, the Arctic might be one area where, for many of these remote systems that don't have a long history of human occupation, where it might be some of the first indicators of human disturbance, or at least human presence or influence on the system. So microplastics and maybe other contaminants. So these microplastics might be coming from atmospheric deposition or ocean currents, or people conducting research on the island and visiting the island or hunting on the island. But they're certainly there, and again in every sample that we look at. And then the last area that we're looking at how microplastics are moving around the Arctic is looking at whether seabirds are transporting microplastics to remote Arctic island colonies. So it's well known that some species of seabirds are consuming plastic debris in marine environments. And with our partners, we're looking at whether they're bringing this plastic back to the remote Arctic island colonies. And again, we do find evidence on these remote Arctic island colonies of microplastics. We also find evidence in the guano of the birds and in their gastrointestinal tract. But again, these photos just show some of the types of plastic fragments and microfibers that we're finding in a bird's guano in this case. And if we sort of do a back of an envelope calculation and extrapolate this out about how often, you know, a bird, so how many birds are on these islands and the frequency of excretion of these birds, which is a bit of a guess to some degree, admittedly, but and how much plastic we're finding per gram of, or unit of guano, we estimate that there's somewhere between 3.3 for northern fulmars and for thick-billed murres, about, because there's more of the birds, they're moving around about 45 million anthropogenic particles every season in these islands through their guano excretion. So this just is one example of how animals might be moving around plastic debris. And the first talk was about research in Chile. I've also read a study about where they were looking at vultures in Chile and how they're moving around plastic debris around their environments as well. So it's just an interesting way. Plastics are clearly anthropogenic in origin, but now that they're released in the environment, their distribution is influenced by other animals. So the conclusions of this work to date are really that, in terms of this workshop, is that microplastic concentration really begins to increase after 1950. So definitely much more of an Anthropocene signal. Microplastics are found almost everywhere and transported by rivers, ocean currents, atmospheres, and animals, or some animals. And we're, as humans, are also moving a lot of microplastics around our environment in biosolids that can provide a clear anthropogenic signal. And that microplastic concentration is low in sediments compared to typical paleoecological indicators. So large amounts of sediment are required for a clear signal of microplastic concentration. Great. That's all I have, so thank you.
Thanks so much, Jesse. That's really an interesting talk, and I think more and more researchers are incorporating this aspect, so that this human trace in their studies. And it's really interesting that you mentioned that it takes a lot of sediment, a large volume of sediment, to actually find the microplastics. So if you're not finding them, it doesn't mean that they're not there.
Yeah, at least in areas where I'm working, that's true. And it's much more similar to macrofossils, the way I think about it. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And also, I was not aware that we're just throwing them back into the environment after we get rid of them in the sewer system.
I think that's in Canada. I'm not sure they do that in Europe anymore. I think they might incinerate the biosolids more in Europe, for example, but yeah.
Probably would be a better idea.
It's a trade-off, I think, because you're losing, there are valuable things in the biosolids, like nutrients, for example, and you would be losing through incineration, but yeah.
Okay, so I would like to ask if anybody has questions for Jesse. Now is the time to ask, and you can either just shout out or write your question in the chat.
I think Pierre might have a question. I see his hand up anyway.
Hi, Jesse.
Hi.
Nice meeting everybody. Jesse, do you, is it possible to make some sort of stratigraphy of plastics in the sediment column, for instance? Do you see one kind of plastic arriving first and then later on other kind of plastics coming in? Yes,
we haven't been able to do that yet, but that would be interesting. And I think in certain areas you could do that. And we've just recently got the ability to sort of ID polymer types of plastic. So much of the earlier work that we've done is just quite simple, counting pieces of plastic under a microscope and characterizing it by color and shape and things like that. But that would be something that I'd be interested in. And I should mention the microplastics we're looking at are bigger than 100 microns. But I do think a growing field is, looking at even smaller plastics and nanoplastics, and they might be at much higher abundance and maybe are even better candidates to look at in sediment cores, and look at some of those changes in polymer types, for example.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any other questions? So, Jesse, would you say that microplastics are a good indicator of the beginning of the Anthropocene in very isolated regions like the Canadian Arctic?
I would think they'd be a good indicator. Yeah, probably almost anywhere globally, like paired with other indicators. But I think it's one thing about microplastics, it's a very clear anthropogenic signal versus other things. So they're not found naturally in the environment, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So it provides a very clear signal that way. And I think as we learn more about it, it's also pretty clear that they're transported. There's both a regional and sort of a global signature, I think, of plastic pollution. But the material, mainly like the size fraction of the plastics, can be used, I think, to give a more global signal, like especially with the microfibers that are transported in the atmosphere versus the larger fragments and things like that provide a much more regional signal.
Mm. So
I think plastics are a good indicator of the Anthropocene, and we know, it should be zero concentration, in the past, and then really starting to increase around the 1950s.
Okay. We have another question in the chat. How much sediment in terms of grams do you use in a sediment core? Yeah,
so that's something that we're struggling with. So we've tried to do a few cores, and then the concentration of the plastics is quite low. So where we get a clear signal, you almost need about 400 grams wet weight type samples, which is a lot of material. But I do think if you're working in other areas and maybe more urban, for example, you can use less material. And there's certainly been studies looking with somewhat normal sized sediment cores and tracing microplastics into the past. So the problem is you have to have a high enough, or at least in our group, we have to have a high enough concentration of microplastics in the sample to distinguish it from potential contamination, because even though we try and be careful and very clean with everything and work under a clean hood and run controls and blanks, it's common, to find one or two pieces of plastic in your control. And if your anthropogenic signal is, 1 or 2 pieces of plastic on top of that, because you don't have a large enough volume, it's really hard to distinguish it. So until our analytical methods for plastic improve, we need a large volume sample to sort of distinguish the signal from potential contamination. If that makes sense.
And that's going to be very time consuming. If you need large samples, like if you took a box core.
Yeah.
And you had your 400 grams of wet weight per sample. And how long would that take you? I mean, it would take forever. If you
Yeah,
had
it's really time consuming per sample because you basically have to digest organic material and then do a sort of a density separation. Yeah.
Okay, maybe one last question. When did the petrochemical industry begin to flourish in Canada?
That's a good question. I'm not totally sure, to tell you the truth, but I would guess the 70s. I don't know. Emily, would
Yeah,
you
I
know?
think so.
Yeah, the
60s or 70s.
yeah. And definitely there was sites before that, but I think it really began to took off in the 60s and 70s. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks so much, Jesse, for agreeing to present your work. It's
Yeah.
really, really, really interesting, and I'm sure we're going to be reading about it in the next years. We're eagerly awaiting all your publications here.